The Express.
Welcome back to the Express podcast for part 2 with Mark Kovacs. On this episode, we discuss athlete development and his experience in training high-level players. We also discuss the importance of being a multi-sport athlete and how technology is shaping the future in sports, both good and bad. Mark also fills us in on how he breaks down athletes in order to maximize their strengths as well as improve their weaknesses. Enjoy. Well, folks, welcome back to the Express podcast. We are running a part 2 with Mark Kovacs. This episode, we're going to focus a little bit more on just the overall nature of developing athletes, the pillars of how to create athletes, as the lovely Bentley shows up in the podcast. Yeah. She might have something to say about. She's one to ask a few questions about. Yeah,
she's on a
sprint
streak.
Speed.
Talk about an athlete.
Yeah, talk about an athlete. Yeah. Sprint speed, all-time high. But just some things, some flaws that we're seeing in athletes these days. What amateurs can do to develop into more of a professional rank, and then let Mark kind of lead the discussion on sports science and technology and where things are going. So we're looking forward to this episode. It's going to be a fun one. So thanks for sticking around to film a part 2. But just for starters, I do want to talk about when we get into the process of developing athletes, what are some of the fundamental ways in which you kind of break them down to be able to create plans and for different sports and things like that?
Yeah, I think with the athletes in general, you have to understand what the demands are for the sport for them, not just what the demands are for the sport. If you don't know the sport, then you're just going to take sort of generalities. But ideally, you want to personalize and make it as specific for each athlete. And that takes some work because you got to, one, understand their position or what they do. Then you've got to figure out where their strengths and weaknesses are through some form of testing. So everything starts with sort of some testing. It could be skill testing, it could be strength testing, endurance testing, agility testing, vision testing. There's all sorts of things we test because we want to know sort of where are your strengths and opportunities. And a lot of the time the athlete knows some of them because they know, hey, I don't do this well, or I'm not as good as other people on the team in this area. I got to get better at this, or coach has told me I got to get better at that. So you have a list of things that are subjective or, have come from somewhere. But then you want to get some objective data to figure out, is that true? Is it real or is it feel? That concept of a lot of people misinterpret sometimes. They think that they're not as good in some areas where they're actually pretty good. They're maybe not exposing it well enough. So they're not delivering on their skill. There's a lot of athletes that are explosive, but they don't change direction well. Meaning they can move quickly, but they can't decelerate well. And that's usually the differentiator in most of those athletes. And the NBA is the best at looking at this. If you just look at a James Harden or a Doncic or one of these guys that you wouldn't say is the most explosive player on a team, but they always seem to be in space. They always find a way to separate from the defender. That's because their deceleration ability is unbelievable.
They said at the combine stuff with Luka that it was legitimately off the charts at his ability to decel, and that's why his step back and it's like, how is he always open? He's the best player on the floor. Mm-hmm. It's because he physically can do things that other people can't in terms of the change of direction, which it's so wild to think about.
That's why when you watch him play, you're like he had 70 or whatever versus us. I'm sorry, I didn't want to bring that up, but yeah, you watch him play, and it's like he's not moving fast. It's like we talk about Patrick Mahomes. Mm-hmm. He doesn't move incredibly fast, but his ability to start, stop, and go and change direction is what makes him so good. And then he uses that to find the windows, find the holes, and it's just sort of interesting how, especially at the NBA, just how quickly they can stop on a dime or move. Like, I'd love to see like Kyrie Irving or someone that's real shifty.
Yeah. One thing I kind of want to, it just came to my mind, I really want to get into is because tennis is more or less like your bread and butter and your background and what you are, I would say, most involved with, if I'm not mistaken. I remember one time we were having a conversation and we were just talking about kind of like this big three that we've been able to watch in our lifetime in terms of the Federer, Djokovic, and Nadal. Could you give a little bit of kind of almost like background on their games? And I remember you saying to me, like, every parent, when they come to you with a kid, wants their son to play like Roger Federer. What kind of stands out about each of those guys and what makes them so great and so different? And then I'm gonna put you on the spot and ask you who the best tennis player of all time is.
Yeah, go.
That's a great question, and it's been asked a lot. And I've been lucky because I've been on the court with all three of them. So I've had players that have played against them, practiced with them. So I've been around them enough to see a lot of their daily work. And they're all three very different. They're all exceptional, obviously, best of all time type talent. But they do things very different. And a lot of people gravitate to Federer's movement and game style because he has that deceleration
Silk.
ability.
Yeah, it's Dancy's
So-
boy.
Yeah, and everyone would agree he's the most sort of natural looking, easiest looking. He can produce power with the least amount of effort. All of that. There's definitely a genetic component to that, but there's also a training. If you actually, you can see some of this on YouTube, see some of the stuff when he was 14, 15, 16. He did some pretty interesting training. Partly grew up playing soccer, which helps with a lot of these athletes, but doing a lot of single leg work back when single leg work wasn't a big thing. Now it is. Doing a lot of different creative moves where you're having to move with the lower body and then do things with your upper body to dissociate. So there was some significant training that went into it. But then Nadal is what I call the power mover. He's just a beast. You know, there's guys in every sport that you can think of that are like that.
You said he's like almost like a freak up here. Like he is like a bull.
Yeah, no, he's got a mentality and a obsession and a way that in the locker room it's pretty interesting. You would know when he's a fun guy in the locker room, joking, friendly with people, really good guy. But the moment he puts his headband on, his game face comes on, and he's like, everyone's
Like
gonna
the
leave.
war paint.
It is.
Yeah.
But everyone knows you sort of separate. It's like everyone takes 5 steps back because he's getting ready for battle, and that's his cue to do that. So he has a whole sort of way of going about everything based on his personality and based on his physicality as well. And then Djokovic is sort of a hybrid of both of those guys. He's a pretty smooth individual in how he moves, and he's got more mobility than anyone on the planet, pretty much.
Which he put a big emphasis on. There's a big thing that came out a couple years ago when his career really took off. And I'm not going to say part of it was because, the Federer and Nadals were maybe not as healthy as they had been in their primes. But his prime just started later. And he attributed a lot of that to like the diet and the stretching mobility routine just got out of this world, and he was healthy and could outlast people on a tennis court.
Yeah, to me, from a personality standpoint, him and Tom Brady seem to have a lot of similarities in how they go about their life. They're very, very, I mean, everyone is very disciplined and obsessive about their outcome, but those guys have probably taken it to another level of how detail orientated they are about every little thing they do. And it obviously has worked phenomenally well, because he's stayed healthy. He had a lot of health-related issues when he was young, coming up on tour. He couldn't play 5 sets. He couldn't outlast guys. Guys knew if they could stay with Djokovic, he would win, because he would wilt under the heat or the pressure or whatever it was. He had a lot of issues with breathing and things like that, and he sort of fixed all of those. He's found solutions, and that's a testament to trying to find solutions every year to get better. So, I mean, those guys are, and then the next generation, like in every sport, there's always a next generation of stars that come up. Those guys just did it so long and had so diverse personalities that it brought a lot of people into the sport and like to watch the great athleticism that they showed.
Tennis is electric to watch. Like when you watch the dudes go at it, I mean, the Nadal, Federer, Wimbledon matches and the battles that they had. So who would you say is
Out of those three,
who do you think's the GOAT tennis player?
it's a tough question. Like
That's what we're here for, Mark. That's what we're here for.
I mean, Djokovic is the guy you have to give it to because of the results. I mean, he's done it on paper. So I think that's, to me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, he's got the results. If he gets
And
another
he's still going.
slam, yeah. If he wins
That's
another
what's
slam,
wild,
he sort of
bro.
shuts the door on
Right.
it. But again, moving the needle on excitement and things like that, I think he's at a different level. Nadal's really close, but Federer's transcended the sport.
I think that's how I see it.
Yeah.
It's just like that's who I first probably related to watching him play in terms of just the fluidity, and he kind of made tennis this new brand, and then Nadal was just a part of it in terms of the
rivalry.
yeah. But I mean, his French Open domination is spectacular, but
And in rivalries, you need two different types. You need personality differences and
Mhm.
style differences. McEnroe and Borg had it. Navratilova and Chris Evert had it. Agassi and Sampras had it. Completely different people, completely different game styles. That's what makes great rivalries, is just the difference of what they bring to the table. And one-on-one sports do that. I mean, that's the coolest part about one-to-one. It's head-to-head battle. It's not always about how well you play. You just got to play better than the person on the other side of the net. So you don't have to play great. You just got to be 1 point
That's
better,
where the mentals come
basically,
in.
than the person
Yeah.
across the net, which is a whole different way of approaching life.
I just got one last thing I want to ask about tennis real quick before we move on to something else. Who would you say are kind of the up and comers that you've seen or worked with that you think have a chance to be?
Yeah, like on the women's side, Coco Gauff's an unbelievable
Shout out.
person, talent, the whole thing. I've been lucky to spend a lot of time with her over the last decade, and she's like, got all those qualities that you would expect to have someone to have a really long, successful career. So she's going to bring a lot of interest, attention. She already has, but she's only just getting started. So I think that'll be a lot of fun. On the guy side, there's a lot of players coming up. Alcaraz is like the Nadal of the next generation. Same basic structure, how he plays, how physical he is. He's great to watch. Challenge for him is, can he stay healthy? With guys like that are so explosive, when you're that explosive, you got to be able to stop. And the hardest part is that's where most of the injuries happen in tennis, is when you have to stop and slow your arm down or slow your legs down. And he's already got a lot of little stuff that's bothering him. So I'm hoping he can stay healthy, because he'll be great. Sinner, who just won the Australian Open, great talent, really young. He was a professional skier, really, and he had to make a decision.
That's crazy.
At about 16, was he going to be a professional skier or tennis player? And he was unreal at skiing. I mean, he still is, but he chose tennis as his career path.
That's interesting. Dual sport athlete.
And then the Americans are actually
Shocker.
really close. I mean, Francis Tiafoe, who I've spent a lot of time with, traveled with him for a number of years. He's right on the cusp. You got Taylor Fritz. You've got Tommy Paul from North Carolina. You've got a couple other younger ones coming up. Ben Shelton, who's an Atlanta guy. His dad was the women's tennis coach at Georgia Tech.
Right,
Yeah, and then the men's coach at Florida. So you've got a bunch of these guys all pushing their names that some people hopefully have heard. They're about top 30 in the world, all of them. So they're really good. But in the US with tennis, unless you're winning slams, no one talks about you. And that's the biggest challenge.
They were saying Wimbledon last year, they were kind of previewing some of the Americans, which we had a couple who made like it further than what they were expected to, right?
Yeah.
And so just how I feel like I don't know. Maybe you could speak a little bit more on that, of the background of popularity of tennis and the growth of the sport in America over the last
tennis
decade.
and golf combo, really.
Yeah. Well,
Golf
and
was it too.
how much of that is due to like COVID? Like people say COVID saved golf because it was one of the only
That
things
you
you
could
could
do.
do,
Yeah.
right? And same, I mean, you all started playing tennis during COVID. So it's kind of like, how has the sport grown over the last 10 years in the States? And it's kind of like the soccer thing, right? Like soccer is starting to become more of a sport, especially in the United States, and it's growing, which is going to impact our national team. And so,
Yeah, no, I mean, the more people play, it's a numbers game like everywhere. The more people play, the more good athletes and, potential professional athletes are going to come out of that pipeline. The challenge, like everything, I think, is the time it takes, like in all sports, to be really good at anything, is you've got to sort of, be willing to give up a lot of other things. And I think that's the hardest part with a lot of these sports. But tennis specifically has grown a lot. Golf's grown unbelievable because of COVID. The beauty about a lot of those sports, you can play them for a lifetime. So I think a lot of reasons why, say, parents got kids into them at a younger age is
because they were doing them, and
they were able
tag
to still
along.
do
Yeah.
it with a child, and then if you're older, you can still do it. There aren't many other sports that
Right.
you can play in your 40s, 50s, 60s. So that's the value, I think, of some of those lifetime sports.
Yeah. What moving forward a little bit, want to talk about what you kind of see in amateur athletes when it comes to performance, when it comes to training and preparation versus what you see in professionals, the differences and advice you'd kind of give to the younger generation, the kids, to get to that next level. What do you kind of
Yeah,
see
I mean,
in that realm?
a large number of the people I deal with are youth athletes, and then the parents of youth athletes. So they're the ones bringing the kids to whatever it is, the training, the games, things like that. And the challenge the parents have now, which is tough on them, is there's so much information out there, they don't know who to listen to. And so I always tell the parents, don't listen to the other parent. That's probably not the person you should listen to because they're going through the exact same thing you are. Who's to tell you that they know any more than you do? So listen to people that have done it, coaches that have been around a long time, people that have gone through the system and understand the pitfalls, because it's like taking, financial advice from a broke person. You probably wouldn't do that. So why would you take advice on developing a youth athlete from a parent who hasn't done it? So that's probably one of the big challenges. The biggest advice really is, and again, everyone says it, no one does it, is play as many sports as you can when you're young. Don't over specialize too early because one, the data shows that you don't have great results with that. I mean, there's a lot of research in this space, especially in team sports. Individual sports has a little bit of different data, but team sports specifically is you want to play multiple sports pretty much as long as you can until the point where the travel requirements usually cause you to have to make some decisions. But that is one of the factors that I think a lot of people don't do, though. I mean, in baseball, in tennis, you're hearing about these places that are like you have to commit to an entire season and can't play anything else. Travel team this and schedule that so that a 8-year-old is committing to one sport. And from a purely a physical development standpoint, that's a bad idea because they're not getting all the other skills that they need. If you play baseball, football, tennis, golf, throughout a year, you're developing all your skills. You're learning how to move and cut and tackle and fall. And then in, say, golf and tennis, you're learning hand-eye. You're learning how to strategize. So you're learning all these skills that may or may not transition perfectly to your final sport, whatever that is, but you're getting really well-rounded.
Yeah.
The other thing with parents is if they got really young kids, I always say do gymnastics for a few years when they're young. It's one of the best starter sports. So at 4 years old, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, get them into gymnastics and get them into soccer. Purely because pretty much they're just moving, but they're learning how to use their body, how to fall, how to cut, how to stop, how to start, all those things. And that sets them up longer term to then specialize at whatever point it is.
Yeah. We talked a couple episodes ago about his hitting coach talking about his old coming off a pick in basketball to help him engage his hips when he's in the batter's box. Had he not played basketball, that's maybe a coaching tip that he never comprehends how to get his hips into it.
Yeah, I know it's hard too because just looking at the high school level. So for those of you that do not know, high schoolers, or I guess I don't know, I guess it starts younger, but you get a ranking based on what tournaments you play in and all of this. And so one of the issues that we had was one of our better tennis players was a baseball guy, and then you run into this whole ordeal where he may not be able to play in certain tournaments to get the ranking that he probably is. So then how your 1, 2, 3 works is based on their ranking. But even though he's like ranked the third, he might be
The best.
our number one
Number
guy.
one,
And so
right.
then other programs get upset because it looks like you're
Sandbag.
You're trying, yeah,
correct.
You're
But
strategize.
his
Yeah.
ranking is what it is. And like, well, why is he not playing? Like, well, it's not his first sport. He doesn't know. He's trying
the
to bounce.
system's flawed.
Yeah.
It's going to get better over time because of how much data is going in. All these recruiting services, or pretty much every result now is feeding into a database in all sports. So you're getting much better, clearer data, and now you can substratify down based on, like you said, hey, this guy's only played 4 events, so we have to divide through by him playing 4 events versus someone playing 20, and so their ranking is going to be different. But if you divide it by through how many events they play, the guy that played 4 events may be a better player. Like in tennis now and in golf, you have these rating systems that do that. So that as we get better and better with data, I think that's going to go away a little bit more, but it's still a major problem with the system right now.
Yeah. At what age do you think that the training and the weightlifting and all of that really starts to play a role? Because we talk about, there's this, I'd call it a pandemic of itself, of kids trying to get surgery on their, Tommy John or whatever. And I was talking to a coach yesterday, and his son is going into the 4th grade, and he was saying how some of his friends are getting Tommy John surgery.
It's really sad. I deal with it a lot. So I deal with a few orthopedic guys that work in baseball and tennis, and in the youth space a lot. And it's sad what's happening. I mean, it's a misunderstanding of the negative impact of that longer term. Some people are doing it as a goal to try to improve arm speed as well, which is the craziest part. To get it done preemptively, which I think is really risky. But the ones that are actually getting it because they need it, because they actually have a torn UCL, is a real concern. A 14-year-old should never be tearing a UCL. That tells you that their volume and what they're doing training-wise, weighted balls is a real issue, obviously. There's been an increase in weighted balls, and there's been an increase in arm injuries as a result. So there's some things that need to be adapted. The challenge is a lot of players are willing to take that risk. So, you've got guys that, let's say, are trying to make a college program or get recruited or go into the minors or make the majors. They can increase their velocity in pitching by 3 or 4 or 5 miles. That changes their level. So some of them are willing to do whatever it takes, even though the risk is you may blow out your arm. So for those, as long as they're educated and they know the risk, that's one thing. It's the 13, 14, 15-year-olds that don't know the risks, or the parents don't know the risks. That's the really sad part of it. You may get a few extra miles by what you're doing, but the risk of you blowing out your arm is really high. And is that risk at that age worth it? And then just the volume of games and all of that is just kind of crazy, really. Like it doesn't make them better. And I think that's the problem. The problem is you've got to have enough volume to get better, but you also have enough time to train and adapt and adjust. So I think from a standpoint of the strength training, especially, that's the one that gets asked a lot. When should they strength train? I said they should be strength training from as young as they can comprehend instruction. So that's like 6, 7, 8 years old. But what that looks like is, not what people think. They're not squatting 400 pounds. They're doing, squats, wall sits, lunges. They're doing things that they can control their body and learn how to move and
simplistic
adapt the right
movements.
All the things that we used to do, kind of a part of team. It was a team thing. You'd do a wall sit for a couple minutes or whatever as a basketball team, and just those kind of simple movements, or some of the conditioning after practice, or making it almost a fun, competitive environment to teach some of the primitive movements without necessarily loading the spine or doing presses or this. Like whatever happened to just being able to do some push-ups and some squats, just some body weight squats and some wall sits or some lunges or side-to-side lateral things. Just the overall coordination has kind of gone out the window. And we got a lot of that just from playing outside
multiple
together.
sports,
right? Just do different things together. Wiffle ball, freaking playing basketball,
softball,
softball in the living room. Mom and dad would
somehow let us
destroy the house.
Yeah,
but
I did the same thing growing up, and it's just now it's a lot too much structure in some respects. There's the whole area of free play that has gone missing, and there's a whole line of research looking at the value of free play. Like you said, put a ball out there, have 4, 6 people, and just leave. Let them play for an hour. They'll figure it out. They'll make it fun. It doesn't need to be this drill followed by that drill followed by that drill. But it's hard to charge for that. So a lot of these models are based on the business model of
Yeah.
charging for youth sport. So everything has to be structured, time based, very start stop. There's an instructor. It's a model, which I understand you need a component of that because that is the competitive side. But the play side should be something that goes alongside that, and that's been lost. But from a couple tips, I guess, for how to know when to start loading heavier, which is always the question. Well, when should we load heavier? And a lot of it has to do with the concept of peak height velocity. So how quickly is someone growing? It's not how much are they growing, but it's the speed of growth. And usually most youth males get two pretty big peaks in their cycle, usually 11, 12, and then 14 through 16, somewhere in that zone. Both those time periods is risky to load heavy because their bones are growing a lot and their coordination is really bad. So usually you do more mobility, more stability, and more endurance during those periods. And then after your second peak is when about 6 months after that to 18 months after that, you have this window where your hormone levels are going through the roof. I mean, we all know it. It's that high school male, they can put on 30 pounds of weight in a year by going to the weight room and eating and doing all the things they do. It's that period where you do want to load them. You want to really start lifting pretty heavy because it's an optimum window for hormone adaptation and growth. And so if you structure it right, you technically have them doing everything they need to do just before that, making sure that their mobility is good, they're stable, they've got a good foundation, and then you start actually loading them pretty heavy for that sort of 6 to 18 month period of time, which you'll get the best results. Doesn't mean you won't keep lifting after that, but that's like an optimum schedule if you can do it.
It's like almost teach them how to walk before they run. Like I'm going to make sure we're as mobile as possible in this certain window, and then we'll then gain the strength within that mobility when the time is right.
Because most of these youth athletes are pretty bad, actually. If you look at them physically, they can't squat well, they can't lunge well, they have trouble doing pull-ups and push-ups. There aren't that many at 15, 16, 17 that can do that stuff. Yet somehow they're squatting 300-400 pounds. So it doesn't really equate. You can't even control your own body, but we're loading you up really heavy.
So just building off of that, there are, I would say, a certain percentage of parents, and we always joke as coaches, it's like the parents who weren't the athlete that they're trying to make their son or daughter become, and they're kind of living through them, which every parent obviously lives through their kid in certain moments. But the individualized specialty training of the youth, and I'm not talking 14, I'm talking 7, 8,
like elementary
school kids, who are specializing in these specific movements, trainings for these specific sports with people. Just kind of your view on that and your take on it.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, really good specialists are valuable because they've got a skill set, they've got experience. It's like a surgeon. If you've got a shoulder problem, you're going to go to a shoulder surgeon that specializes in that. You're not probably going to go to someone that does knees and other body parts. You're going to go to the shoulder specialist. So there's definitely value. The challenge is you got to evaluate, are they really a specialist? Or are they just saying that, hey, they were a picture, so they are a specialist at the curveball? That doesn't mean they are, but we've got to understand, is there a real skill there that is worth their expertise, and at what age? The higher up you get, the more that becomes really important because the margin for error is so much smaller. You want the best people working with you who have the most experience. At the really young ages, I think the whole specialist concept, which is in a lot of sports now, is a real risk because it's multiple voices coming in. So if you've got a team sport coach and then you have a hitting coach and then you have a fielding coach and you have all these different specialists that are not part of that team, you're working with them privately in different ways. Who's coordinating the messaging to make sure that it's consistent? And I don't think it's necessarily anyone meaning anything wrong. It's just the more voices you have, who's going to coordinate it? And obviously the parent doesn't know how to. They don't have the skill set. So in the youth sports space, there's really no one to coordinate that. In the professional sports space, it's still a challenge. I deal with it all the time. We have some big teams with some of the athletes where they've got multiple specialists that get brought in. The agent brings someone in, the parent, the girlfriend. There's all sorts of people bringing people in because they think it sounds good, and it may. Sometimes it does. Most of the time, it doesn't because they don't know what else is going on, and it's the context that is lost.
Do you have a question? I was gonna. So, what in your mind, if you were to form like a team for an athlete, and I know it can be a little bit different based on team sport, individual sport. What is kind of the right number that you think, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, again, you've got these buckets of areas that every athlete needs to get better at. So you sort of have if it's a performance team, there needs to be a director or someone who's directing the team, who vets it and who coordinates the messaging. Parents many times are that person. They have to be. They're the ones that do logistics, scheduling, but they're usually not the most skilled at it. So in an individual sport, it's usually the head coach, the tennis coach, the golf coach, whoever it is. It's usually that person, and then they all bring in whoever's going to help on the physical side. So there's going to be someone that's going to provide physical expertise. Then there's going to be someone on the mental side usually who provides expertise. And then there's usually going to be someone else that may help in different areas. It could be medical, as needed if the physical person doesn't have that skill set. It could be nutrition. It could be these different areas. So the smaller the team, the better. I mean, I think 4 people is a good number.
Mm-hmm.
Once you start getting more than about 4 people involved, it gets a lot harder.
Too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah, you definitely do. You burn down some kitchens, and I've seen it a lot. Tennis is one of the worst for that because the player is, tennis is a tough sport because you only win a few tournaments a year, so you're losing every week of the year. Kind of like baseball, you never really feel great because even if you had a good game, you still struck out or you still struggled a little bit at some point. Tennis is the same, so you're always looking for what's next and how do I fix something. And there's always someone who's going to sell you the magic potion or the magic dust that's going to turn it around in one session. And that's the hardest thing. And parents, coaches even are looking for it because they're trying to protect their jobs and stay with the player. So they're searching to find who's going to give us the best likelihood of success. And sometimes they make really bad decisions as well, even though they're not meaning to. They're just reaching and hoping, and hope is not a strategy.
Yeah, especially at a young age, man. I mean, I was fortunate to have some good coaches, obviously, that would help with the skill component, and then, ran into a couple people that could kind of keep me healthy in that regard. But the mental was a lot of me figuring it out, and very fortunate that my sister was really involved in the psychology realm. So she would I'd be somewhat of her experiment to be able to bounce things off of. But I mean, as a professional, I have you as a more the physical strength trainer side, have a mental wellness, coach that helps me develop those skills, have a nutritionist that I work with. And then during the off season, and in season, have a couple different PTs I do stuff with just based on location. But I mean, that's about the extent of the team, and I think that if you can just have an expert in each realm and keep it small, like he's talking about, that's probably the way to go. But a lot of it is especially as a youth or an amateur, you don't want to just box yourself in. You got to figure things out yourself, and you figure things out by watching the best in the world at what they do, trying to mimic some of those movement patterns, understanding how you move. A lot of it is just self-discovery. And I think that nowadays we don't give kids a chance to necessarily discover themselves, learn and be able to apply what they do well. Like I said, I was talking to kids up at Marietta the other day, and my biggest message to them that I still do every offseason is, how can I go back to my core, to my roots, what I'm good at as a man, as a baseball player, as a leader, and how can I get better at those? How can I get back to doing what it is that I'm good at doing instead of always looking at fixing? It's almost like a positive perspective versus a negative perspective. If I'm always trying to fix my swing, to fix my body, to fix this, it's very easy to get in the rut of, well, every time I'm doing something, I'm doing it to fix something, as opposed to every time I'm working out, every time I'm fielding ground balls, I'm grooving my swing, I'm grooving my body, I'm getting it ready to perform, as opposed to, no, I'm trying to fix it so I can play better today. And I think that in itself is a powerful lens to look at, sport and life through.
Yeah, it's kind of like the driving range versus the actual course theory. When you're playing in a tournament, or just like for any amateur, if you're at the driving range, you're not trying, or you're hitting before a round, you're not trying to really fix stuff there. Like, you're just kind of preparing and grooving your swing. Same thing for, there's obviously little things that tour guys work on all the time, but for some of them, you'll hear them talk who view the game very simplistically. They're like, yeah, like when I'm warming up, like I'm not hitting 100 balls. Like I'm just grooving making sure I still got what I got. And then I'm going and reacting, playing, learning, and playing
seeing
with
how
what I
the
have.
swings, it's going a little right today.
So I'm playing it so it's
that-
going
we're
right.
playing that way
You know what I
today.
mean? It's
Yeah.
just kind of interesting. And then you see it at like different levels too, because I cover a lot of these high-end travel national teams or whatever during the summer. And you see all these guys in the stands, and you'll have the head coach, and then you've got, like, for example, the guy calling pitches. There's always the guy in the bucket that's signaling the pitches. And then you may have the pitching coach in the stands, or the dad in the stands who, like, I was at a game, they ran into a situation where the head coach had to remove someone from the stands because they were calling pitches, not like they were overruling what the head coach was calling. And he's like, it's not your realm here, like what you do. So it's kind of interesting too, because at a professional level, so take something like, you guys have a hitting coach, right? But it's got to be way different than high school. But even high schoolers have that, where we'll have guys come in and we'll try to work on, their approach or how they're just getting through the zone or whatever. And they're like, well, that's not what my hitting coach is telling me to do. So then it's like,
And
how do you tell
that's the
them?
issue,
Like, they're paying their hitting coach. So how do you say, well, and same thing for you. Like, how does your hitting coach, like, I'm working on this. This is what me and Brum been working on the off season, et cetera, et cetera. That's kind of an interesting, like, gray area.
And I think it goes back to the communication. Is because, again, too, with high school, you play on your high school team. That's a set of coaches. Then you play travel. That's a whole different set
crew.
of coaches.
Yeah.
So they're, at the end of the day, the goal is for the athlete to reach their highest potential. But without the communication, it overwhelms sometimes.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a bit is the communication and the clarity, because if the hitting coach, let's say the hitting coach is right and they're onto something, and maybe the high school coach, whoever, maybe they're kind of offline or vice versa, then being able to have a conversation so that same lingo can be used on certain kids, and maybe they are trying to get the same end result, but the thought process may be a little bit differently, and how you can balance the two. And I think it just takes work, takes communication. It takes like the willingness to want to do it.
I feel like
And
ego kind of plays
coaches
a role
listening,
too.
if there are coaches listening, that's what I deal with all the time. I speak with coaches that we work with an athlete together in different realms, and sometimes there's disagreements. They want to do something. I think it should be done a different way. You've got to come at it from what's the best thing for the athlete as best you can. And most of the time, you're not that far off if you're working with good people. The hard part is sometimes you do have big experience gaps. Sometimes there are really skilled, experienced people, and then there's a rookie type coach who may not know what they're doing, and they're overdoing, and they're maybe not willing to listen to the experienced coach. And that's the hard part. And that's where the parents get stuck in the middle, because they don't really know.
Well, how many times have you gotten calls from Cubs people, and they're like, what do you think about doing this or trying this? And I'm just like, call Mark first, run it by Mark. Y'all have a conversation, and then let him filter it back to me to say, well, yeah, it sounds great, but maybe the execution of how they're wanting to do it is wrong. Why would they want to be doing this now? Or, yeah, no, that sounds great. I think that's a great idea. Allowing someone that obviously I pay and trust with my career, have him filter the information to me, as opposed to me just run with it. He's kept out of the loop, and then all of a sudden I'm like, hey, I've been doing this, and he's like, well, why have you been doing that? That doesn't add up to our program that we've been running for the last few months.
Right. And at the professional level, his goal is to make you obviously be your best product, and the Cubs want you to be the best product.
Correct.
And that, I think at the high school level, the gap of what you're talking about sometimes can be very large, to where, some of the travel coaches or whatever that you're playing for,
Mhm.
these guys have played in the league, they've been around the game for a long time, and they may just have that extra little edge of, hey, this is what we really should be doing just from experience, right? Like, I had a coach once tell me, it's hard to coach quarterbacks if you've never played it. This is what it is. You're just not going to see things the same. You're not going to view things the same. It's hard to coach shortstop if you've never played it.
Yeah.
This is kind of interesting kind of perspective, but I do think the communication is key, and it's just interesting how that works at the professional level, like the people listening to this, understanding the communication. So if you're a parent, to where, yes, you do have that hitting coach, and the high school coach maybe is trying to tweak something, and maybe he is onto something. I think, like a lot of what you all do, is you got to put the ego aside and at the door, and it's not, oh, my way's the right way. It's, what are we doing best for the athlete? Because that's the end goal.
Yeah, and it's also, what does the athlete resonate with? Sometimes it's the cue that works. It's not even the philosophy or the physics of it. Sometimes the physics is what it is, but the cue that other person's giving seems to be getting him to do it better than what you may be wanting him to do. And if that cue works and it gets the result, then that's great, and you run with it. And that happens sometimes, that it's sort of a weird cue. There's all sorts of experiences where that's happened, where a cue that is wacky in theory gets them in the right position because it resonates with them. And so sometimes is the outcome achieved maybe in a unique way because the athlete's unique, or how they process information's unique. And that's the hardest part.
The last thing I want to touch on, I'm just going to kind of let him have the floor, is he kind of has more of the expertise in like sports technology, sports science, and where that trend is going, and some of the things that you like and things that you're seeing that are very advantageous for athletes in development versus things and trends that may not be all it's cracked up to be.
Yeah, it's a great field. I mean, it's a field that I got into really early, and when I, in the early 2000s, that was sort of the area I was getting into. That was before wearables, the iPhone hadn't come out, so you didn't have Bluetooth, you didn't have all these apps and the ability to measure stuff in real time. It was all lab based. So people had to come to a lab with $100,000 pieces of equipment and get something tested. Think of VO2. Think of a force plate back then was about a $50,000 to $100,000 piece of equipment, and it was in a lab, and it had to be calibrated every time. It was a pain. But that was what I did. That was my background. So for me, it was fun. It was normal, and I was able to sort of learn that as this became common practice in the last decade. The sort of wearable technology aspect has made things real now. So you can wear a lot of stuff to monitor heart rate, to monitor blood capacity. So, your blood oxygen levels. You can measure your strength levels in the weight room rep by rep. You can measure your velocity of movement. How fast is a movement? Are you able to produce power as well? So all these things are super valuable if you know what to do with them. The challenge is, how often do you need to do it? I think that's where people are sort of maybe taking it to the wrong level. So like if I'm monitoring someone's power, do I need to do it every day? Probably not. I want to see, are they improving week by week? Are we moving in the right direction? Monitoring it every day gives you information, but then what do you do with that information? If they're down that day by, let's say, 5%, their power output's 5% below what it was the day before, how does that change your decision about what you're doing in training? In some of the team sports, especially, they're making big decisions for these athletes based on the numbers on a screen. And sometimes it's only 5 or 10% difference, which in the past, that wouldn't affect anything. You do whatever you were scheduled to do that day, and you would train through it. And your body may be a little fatigued, but you would adapt. The whole point of fatigue is, can your body handle it and get better around it? And if you stop that process, you actually start underloading. And that's the biggest thing I've seen in the last probably 7-8 years is the amount of underloading that's going on. In the youth sport, there's overloading. Youth sports are doing too much. But as you get into college and pro, in a lot of areas, you're starting to see this underloading where you see it in the NBA, you see it in the NFL as well, is that the practices have become a lot less. Part of it, it's the CBA, the agreements and the time that they're allowed to do certain things, but a lot of it is the metrics that they're gathering. They're showing that the athlete is a little fatigued, but if you stop training or reduce training when someone's fatigued, you're gonna do less and less training. But then you're still asking them to compete in the same number of games at the same level against monsters that you're trying to compete against. So we know there's an increase in injury rates in all these pro sports predominantly. And even though we know a lot more, and to me, that's the main reason, is there's this undertraining component because many people are misutilizing some of the data. So that's one aspect. The other thing is genetics testing is becoming a real popular area, which links into this whole sports science area. So if you know that there are certain genes that predispose individuals to have better endurance or better strength or weaker joints, so from a ligament standpoint, if you know that at a younger age, you can potentially structure your training programs more personalized from a very young age. So that's a really kind of interesting area. Again, genetic testing has a lot of potential challenges if you don't understand what it means. But if you use it for the right things, it can allow you to be more strategic in how you set up programming. From a standpoint of sort of other metrics that are being used, I mean, the things that are out there like Oura rings and whoops and things like that, a lot of them are focused on trying to estimate stress in someone's life. So heart rate variability, is really the ability for you to manage a form of stress, autonomic nervous system response. So you got parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system response to a situation. Parasympathetic sort of lowers your stress level, so to speak. Sympathetic raises it. And you're trying to live in this sort of, ideal environment where it never gets ideally too high or too low, or when it does, it gets back to neutral as soon as possible. So you can monitor that now in different ways. You have to be a little careful with what the data is showing because it's not that reliable. And that's the problem. People are over relying on one number, and the human body is super complex. So the challenge is we can't over rely on one number, but that number can maybe provide a thought process of how you may go about training, recovery, things like that. So it can help, but too many people, I think, put too much emphasis on it. And so we have to be careful with that. There's a lot of stuff coming out monitoring sweat now. Analysis of sweat's probably going to be the next evolution of how we test people. So, we can test electrolytes. That's been around for a while. But now you're going to get into potentially testing lactate through sweat and testing a few other variables. So as people are exercising, you can get real-time data on how things are progressing, and then you can adapt. So there's a lot of stuff out there. The challenge
that's
is
the hard part. That in essence is the hard part of having so much out there that what's the focus? Are we giving too much? Are we kind of just running in all these different directions, hoping that something sticks? And I think that that's probably the hard part and the challenge, because maybe doing more power testing for one athlete works really well. Well, that may not work for athlete B over here, or maybe the Whoop and Aura stuff really helps and works for this athlete, but it doesn't for the one that does the power stuff. Like there's so many variables that go into it, and people have different stress responses. There's so many things, and like I said, it's the human body is so complex that we're silly to think that we can make it simple.
Well, and that's kind of the issue, I think, for the everyday person. Like Mitch and I track each other's workouts and stuff like that, and we're keeping up with what we're doing day to day. And I was wearing the Whoop, then I switched back, but because I think I don't know if I can say that. If I can't say it, I'll cut it out. But you were wearing the Whoop for a little bit, and then you and I had talked, I guess, almost a year ago. And my problem was, so I have a 6-month-old as of today, but when he was born, my recovery every day was like 1%. And so it was, you know what I mean? Like it was literally telling me, hey, your strain needs to be this. And in my brain, I'm going, okay, maybe for today, but then the next day my recovery is still not great, which is my sleep and all of that. And I'm like, well,
I gotta get this work.
this can't be another. This cannot be another day where I'm not loading my body. Like I guess that may be an old school technique of mental toughness. Like I need to get the work done. I need to do this, but it's kind of hard for me as a person because I'm not playing a professional sport. You know what I mean? So I don't.
We don't have our
And the biggest
four-person
concern
team.
No.
with most of the wearables are they're not that accurate.
Right,
So
and that's the other
challenge
issue.
is you can't use that data as gospel. You really can't. You have to make sure that you understand that there's been a new study recently on both of them showing that 30-40% error on certain of the metrics, which is worse than no data sometimes.
Well, and that's like we were talking too of why I don't like the Whoop for certain things is because Whoop is great for cardio, intensity, stuff like that. But when I'm lifting, like I could feel like oh my gosh, I'm worn out after this lift, and my strain's like 4.5, and I'm like, how's that possible? Like I know my body's more strained than that.
I ran into that as well, and I think the biggest value that I got out of some of that stuff is
sleep recovery.
Understanding that time spent in bed, or hey, I was asleep from 11 to 7, but I only got 6 hours of sleep. I didn't get 8 hours, but we kind of say, well, I was asleep for 8 hours, so I must have been, and that's not necessarily the case. So that was one of the things that I discovered is time spent in bed doesn't necessarily equate to
productive
quality sleep, productive sleep, how much you actually slept. And I mean, I wore the Oura ring for a little bit too, and there's some benefits obviously to both. It helps you kind of understand your body, and I think that was the biggest thing is wearing each of them. I understood a little bit more about my body, but it wasn't going to be the end all be all because there were days that I woke up feeling great and my recovery score was crap.
Yeah,
and then there was days where I was in the green, I should feel great, and I
did not.
Feel bad.
And
so why am I going to base off what this is telling me as opposed to
listening to your body
or just maintaining discipline and consistency?
And that's the other thing with like the Apple Watch is you can see how many active calories you're burning, right? But what I liked about the Whoop is I wasn't checking my watch during the workout. I was just working out. Like I wasn't going back and forth.
To me is probably the biggest issue with all these is the people that gravitate to them are already a little bit pedantic about information. So they're already overthinking, and now you're giving them more data to overthink with.
Right.
So it creates this spiral effect of they're always looking at data rather than the feel and just doing what they sort of need to do. So there's that balance, and that's one of the big things I try to do is figure out how long do we use these for, because it won't be forever. It's for short periods to, like you said, get some education and then move on. Okay, we understand this or that, and then which ones do we have to be careful of that they're having too much and it's taking them down a bad path.
Yeah, well, Mark, we appreciate you spending all your time to be with us. It was a pleasure. Hopefully people get some education and insight about what you do and how to become a better athlete, how to develop some of the issues going on today, and how we can hopefully fix those. So appreciate you coming on.
Appreciate
thank you
it.
all. That was fun.
Yeah, good stuff.